Coming up on Arirang News, President Moon Jae-in pledges to bring down South Korea's soaring home prices with even stronger measures if need be. He also promises more job security and jobs of better quality. South Korea and Japan leave their talks at the WTO no closer to a resolution of their trade conflict. Seoul will likely move to set up an independent WTO panel to adjudicate. And the Defense Secretary of South Korea's closest ally, the United States, declines to say whether the U.S. might move some of its troops off the peninsula if Seoul won't agree to pay more for them. It's 4:00 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. The collapse of this week's defense cost-sharing talks between South Korea and the U.S. is raising speculation that Washington might consider reducing the number of American troops stationed on the peninsula. All the more so with the U.S. Defense Secretary refusing to answer reporters' questions about the matter. Kim Ji-yeon reports.
U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper is refusing to speculate on whether the U.S. would consider reducing American troop numbers in South Korea after the U.S. delegation walked out of this week's bilateral defense cost-sharing talks in Seoul. His remarks are in stark contrast to last week when he insisted U.S. troops will remain in South Korea at the current level. In a briefing near Manila on Tuesday, he reiterated that South Korea is a wealthy country that can and should contribute more. The U.S. is said to have requested a five-fold increase of Seoul's contribution by establishing a new article in the cost-sharing deal. It wants $5 billion a year from Seoul, up from the current $870 million to support and maintain some 28,500 American troops stationed in South Korea.
I'm sure that it's in capable hands, and we just take this one step at a time, working closely with our South Korean partners. And look, as I said publicly the other day, South Korea is a wealthy country. They can and should contribute more. And beyond that, I will leave it to the State Department to work out the particulars.
On North Korea, Esper said the allies are prepared to deter any threat and they're ready to fight tonight, a slogan used by the allied forces. It's seen as a way to pressure Pyongyang after it expressed pessimistic views in resuming denuclearization talks with the U.S. after it announced it's postponing the wintertime combined military air drill with South Korea to support diplomatic efforts. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
South Korean lawmakers, meanwhile, are looking for a breakthrough on the defense cost issue at the parliamentary level. This morning, the floor leaders of South Korea's three largest parties, the ruling Democratic Party, the main opposition Liberty Korea Party, and the centrist Bareunmirae Party, left for Washington for a 5-day trip to explain the National Assembly's stance. Speaking to reporters at the airport, the lawmakers said they would stress the importance of maintaining a strong alliance and demand a reasonable and fair share of the defense burden. The three will meet with their counterparts at the upper and lower houses and speak with State Department officials, including Washington's Special Representative for North Korea, Stephen Biegun. A senior North Korean diplomat has arrived in Moscow for strategic talks with Russia on regional and international affairs. According to Russia's TASS news agency, Pyongyang's first vice foreign minister, Choi Sun-hee, was invited by Russian First Deputy Foreign Minister Vladimir Titov for a first round of strategic dialogue. They're set to discuss, quote, the entire spectrum of international issues, regional problems, and bilateral relations. While the exact schedule is not known, Che is expected to meet with Russian foreign ministry officials on Wednesday. North Korea is believed to be trying to strengthen its ties with Russia amid the stalled denuclearization talks with the U.S. On social media this morning, President Moon congratulated South Korean firefighters on their new status starting next April as public servants of the central government rather than local governments. Parliament passed a related bill yesterday to improve the welfare of firefighters. President Moon says this change will prevent regional gaps in public safety while enabling the government to take control at disaster scenes. Two South Korean nationals seized by Houthi rebels in the Red Sea on Monday have been released and are safe. Seoul's foreign ministry said Wednesday that they were freed at 12:40 a.m. Korea time. Their release, it said, was made possible by close coordination between South Korea and its allies, especially the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. Houthi rebels in Yemen had detained 3 boats in the Red Sea, carrying 2 South Korean nationals and 14 others. The rebels claimed the boats, headed from Saudi Arabia to Somalia, violated their territorial waters. South Korea's new southern policy aims to strengthen ties with ASEAN countries in various sectors, including trade, culture, and science. In part 3 of a special series on the upcoming ASEAN-Korea and Mekong-Korea summits, our Yoon Jung-min takes a closer look at this ambitious policy.
Unveiled by South Korean President Moon Jae-in in November 2017 after his trip to Southeast Asia, the new Southern policy envisions more cooperation between South Korea and ASEAN, from culture to the economy. The policy boils down to more exchanges among citizens, economic cooperation, and regional security. In other words, people, prosperity, and peace.
신남방 정책은 대한민국 국가 발전 전략의 핵심입니다. 아세안은 세계 어느 지역보다 성장이 빠르고 앞으로 성장 잠재력도 매우 큽니다. 우리는 아세안과 함께 아시아의 평화와 공동 번영의 미래를 열어야 합니다.
The ambitious plan began amid growing tensions between South Korea and China over the deployment of the U.S. THAAD missile defense system on the peninsula. Traditionally, the Korean peninsula has been affected politically and economically by global superpowers, which has made Seoul feel the need to diversify its foreign policy as a middle power.
Amid strategic competition between the U.S. and China and increasing protectionist mood, the ASEAN prefers to build an inclusive and multilateral cooperation mechanism rather than taking sides between the 2 big powers.
Seoul has expanded its ties not only with individual ASEAN members through bilateral free trade agreements, but also with broader regional blocs, such as through the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Based on this driving force, the 2 sides have been fostering cooperation in other fields as well, including science and cybersecurity.
And ASEAN Korea explored new business opportunities by strengthening platforms or mechanisms of cooperation in many areas, such as infrastructure, ICT, and startup, and financing, and so on.
For a sustainable relationship, experts say both sides should build trust based on mutual respect and interests. They say that in the long run, the policy will see more tangible outcomes. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, South Korea is trying to seal a new free trade deal with Malaysia by the end of the year, which is expected to create a range of opportunities for both sides. Our Kim Bo-kyung tells us more about Malaysia and its relationship with South Korea.
Pristine beaches and dense rainforests that are home to endangered species. Malaysia is also a mix of cultures and hub for regional travel. It is separated into 2 parts, Peninsula Malaysia and East Malaysia, on the island of Borneo, and is home to an estimated 32 million people. More than 80% of the population are under the age of 54, and this young population from a mix of cultures is witnessing the country's rapid development. Malaysia's GDP has been growing at an average of a little less than 5% a year since 2015. And last year's GDP was $354 billion, with a per capita income of around $10,000. Further growth can be expected as Malaysia has successfully diversified its economy away from exporting raw materials and sees a future as a self-sufficient industrialized country. The trade between South Korea and Malaysia have been continuously rising, with their trade volume reaching around $19 billion last year. Malaysia's main exports to Korea are natural resources, semiconductor integrated circuits, and crude oil. In return, South Korea is exporting petrochemicals and semiconductors worth around $9 billion. South Korea and Malaysia decided to push for a bilateral free trade agreement before the end of this year. Both countries are expecting the deal to bring them new opportunities.
If we set a FTA within this year, promoting the combination of Korean wave, or Hallyu, and Malaysia's Halal would be possible. Also, since Malaysia is a well-known leader in manufacturing, Seoul will be able to combine technology that it has been working on, such as robotics and smart cities, with the manufacturing infrastructure Malaysia already has, thus leading the global market together in the fourth industrial revolution.
With stronger ties between the two countries, hopes are high that both countries will be able to create a new model of cooperation in the fields of technology and new culture. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
Last night, in a live broadcast, President Moon Jae-in answered questions from ordinary citizens in a town hall-style forum. Among other things, he was asked about economic issues like Korea's overheated real estate market and the new system of shorter working hours. Lee Min-sun reports.
A slew of economy-related questions were on Korean people's minds during Tuesday evening's televised town hall meeting with President Moon Jae-in. On the issue of soaring housing prices in South Korea, the president insisted his administration has the ability to cope with the situation. He pledged that they won't aim for a short-lived temporary fix, stressing that he wouldn't demand the construction of even more homes in a bid to lower prices.
저는 이게 부동산 문제는 우리 정부에서는 이렇게 자신 있다고 이렇게 좀 장담하고 싶습니다. 지금 현재의 방법으로 부동산 가격을 잡지 못한다면 보다 강력한 그런 여러 가지 이 방안들을 계속 강구해서라도 반드시 부동산 가격을 잡겠다는 말씀을 드리고.
The Moon administration has long tried to tackle rising housing prices, taking a multi-pronged approach to it. But so far, they haven't been able to do too much to ease the problem. Addressing his pledge to create more jobs, the president expressed remorse that he was not able to meet the public's expectations, especially when it comes creating enough quality jobs in South Korea.
최대한 이런 좋은 일자리를 많이 만들어서 우선은 일용직을 전부 이제 이 정규직으로 최대한 전환해서 비정규직을 줄여 나가는 것이 큰 과제 중에 하나겠고요. 또 일용직이면 일용직의 상태에서도 여러 가지 어떤 노동권이나 노동에 관한 여러 가지 고용 안전망을 누릴 수 있도록 그 혜택을 늘려나가는 것도 또 필요한 일이라고 생각합니다.
While the president expressed the content that the government-led shorter working hours system has improved workers' work-life balance, he said more needs to be done to ensure smaller firms can also smoothly implement the system without disrupting their business too much. On his administration's hefty minimum wage hikes over the past couple of years, President Moon said the country is on the right track, and he urged rival political parties to continue fine-tuning the system to ensure it benefits workers, small businesses, and society as a whole. Lee Min-sun, Arirang News.
In other news, Seoul and Tokyo held their second round of talks at the WTO in Geneva on Tuesday in their latest attempt to resolve their trade row over Japan's export curbs. No progress, though, and it looks like Seoul will probably go to the next step in the dispute settlement process, which would be setting up an independent WTO panel to make a ruling. Lee Seung-jae reports.
South Korea and Japan held their second round of bilateral talks in Geneva on Tuesday. It was their latest attempt to resolve the trade row over Tokyo's ongoing export restrictions. The meeting between South Korea's chief negotiator Chung Hae-kwan and its Japanese counterpart Junichiro Kuroda was part of a dispute settlement process under the rules of the World Trade Organization. According to Chung, he will return to Seoul with the outcome of Tuesday's meeting and come up with the next course of action, but a third round of talks is unlikely. Watchers say with the two sides failing to find common ground after 2 rounds of talks, Seoul is likely to push for the next step in the WTO dispute settlement process. In September, Seoul filed a complaint to the World Trade Body, arguing Tokyo's export curbs on 3 high-tech materials to South Korea are inconsistent with Japan's obligations under various WTO agreements. If the two countries fail to narrow their differences and can't reach an agreement within 60 days of the complaint, they can request the WTO dispute settlement body to establish an independent review panel to make a final ruling one way or the other. 이승재, Arirang News.
The United States will soon be able to sell more rice to the South Korean market than ever before. According to a press release from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative on Tuesday, Seoul and Washington reached a deal guaranteeing access to the Korean market for $110 million of U.S. rice per year from 2020. That amounts to approximately 132,000 tons of rice. The agreement comes after years of negotiations on the rice issue, after a WTO measure allowing Korea to protect its market expired in 2014. U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer credited President Trump for the wider access to the Korean market and said the agreement would prove to be, quote, enormously beneficial for American farmers. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Yang Jun-seok, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Dr. Yang, thank you as always for coming on.
Happy to be here.
Well, some perhaps less than positive news for those hoping for a trade deal between the U.S. and China. President Trump warning China that if there is no deal, he'll raise tariffs even higher. What's the story in the markets today?
Okay, well, the U.S. markets this week, the American markets have actually been doing fairly well. S&P and NASDAQ, there has been little changes, but still, they're holding relatively steady near historical highs. Dow has gone down a little bit, but that's because they were at a historical high to begin with. So in a sense, they had no place but to go down. But I think still the markets are overemphasizing the good news, which also makes every bad news that comes out have an adverse effect. So by concentrating so much on U.S.-China trade negotiations, I think it's amplifying the effect of that in the market, stock market, perhaps more than it's justified. Now, the other reasons that the U.S. market is doing so well seems to be that President Trump is continuing to put pressure on the Fed to lower rates. And that, I think, is going to be very interesting in the long run because, well, the Fed said that they're not going to change the rates anytime soon. But if there is going to be so much expectations of a lower rate built into the market, it's going to be interesting to see what the Fed chooses, whether they're going to choose to keep their word and risk a lot of disruption in the market, or just follow the market and try to keep the market calm by lowering the rate another 0.25% within the next 3 or 4 months. Now, the other markets, other than the United States, the European markets and the Asian markets, except China, they were mixed for this week. And China, a little bit of good news, I guess. Their stock markets, both Hong Kong and Shanghai, seems to have risen a little bit during this week, but that's partially because it fell so much during the last week. And I think there, the government stimulus plans are having more effect in the market than the trade negotiations.
Right. Well, speaking of those negotiations, the IMF's been saying that even if the U.S. and China do strike a deal, economies like Korea, the EU, and Japan will be affected. I think that's clearly true. Why is it that their exports would suffer, and how badly would Korea be affected?
Okay, well, the U.S.-China trade war, it's actually only one of the problems that we're facing right now, not only Korea, but globally. Other problems include economic slowdown in China, which has been going on even before the trade war. And organizations like ESCAP, they've been saying that the Chinese economic slowdown will probably have a bigger effect than the U.S.-China trade war. The U.S.-China trade war affects perhaps about 4% of Chinese GDP, but when the Chinese growth slows down, it could obviously affect a lot more than just 4% of the GDP. And from the point of view of Korea, the potential risks, I think, reflect that. The UN ESCAP organization did a survey last year, and about 1.2% of Korean exports, Korean GDP in terms of value added, were potentially affected by the trade war. But when you consider, in addition, the Chinese economic slowdown, that percentage went up to 15 to 18%. So for Korea and the rest of the world as well, the Chinese economic slowdown is as big or even bigger problem than the trade war. And in addition to that, we have economic slowdown and uncertainty in Europe as well. And then there's the problem of whether President Trump will impose a high tariff on automobiles. If that takes place, that also has a potential to have more effect in Korea than the U.S.-China trade war. So even if we do muddle through the U.S.-China trade war, there's actually a lot of other problems that we have to muddle through.
Well, meanwhile, in Korea, we have Moody's pointing out some problems in Korean companies. Of the 24 firms it monitors, it has a negative outlook for 14 of them. Can you comment on that?
Okay, well, obviously the Korean economy is in a very serious slowdown right now, and we just had third quarter reports at the end of October, and most of them have not been very good. Now, if you look at the individual corporate reports, 3 out of 10 firms experienced earnings shocks. This includes not only the firms that are being monitored by Moody's, but firms that are in the Kospi stock market. And as I said, 3 out of 10 experienced an earnings shock, lower earnings that were much lower than what the market has expected. That includes Hyundai Motors, which earnings came in 29% below expectations, LG International, which came in 22.8% below expectations, Samsung C&T, which came in 21.4% below expectations. And then if you look at the Kospi firms altogether, then the operating profits for all the firms that are registered in Kospi fell for 4 straight quarters, and only about 3 out of 17 industrial groups had increasing profits in the third quarter. Now, one of the problems with rating agencies is they don't always foresee problems. We saw this in the Asian financial crisis and global financial crisis. Sometimes they overestimate or do not fully account for all the risks, and then when those risks come up, they make adjustments very quickly. That may be what's happening at Moody's here. I think for the last year or so, they somewhat underestimated the problems that Korean firms had, and then now because of the bad reports that we've seen in the third quarter, maybe they're overreacting to it a bit and dropping the ratings much faster than it should, but I think that's in the nature of the ratings agencies.
All right, Dr. Young, very interesting discussion, but we'll have to leave it there for today. Thanks so much for sharing your insights, as always.
Thank you.
Now, railway workers in Korea have started an indefinite strike, demanding better pay and working conditions. Some passengers have already been inconvenienced by delays and cancellations, as our Kim Jae-hee reports.
The Korean Railway Workers Union went on an indefinite strike as of 9 a.m. Wednesday. Substitute workers were in place to operate high-speed KTX and commuter trains, but passengers are already being affected. KTX trains are expected to run at around 69% of usual levels. SRT trains will run at around 78%. Commuter trains are expected to operate at some 60%, and freight trains 31%. During off-peak hours, subways in Seoul are expected to run at about 82% of usual levels. This is the union's first indefinite strike in 3 years. There was transport chaos in South Korea in late 2016 when they walked off the job for 74 days. The union and Korea have held numerous talks since May, but couldn't narrow their differences. Korea workers and management last held talks on Tuesday, but again failed to reach a compromise on wages and employee numbers. The union workers are currently demanding a 4% increase in basic salary and an additional 4,600 workers. Korea has been operating a 24-hour emergency transportation unit since Monday. The CEO of the Korea, Son Byung-seok, said on Wednesday that Korea will do its best to ensure passenger safety and resolve the issue with the union through dialogue. The Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport has also mobilized alternative means of transportation in consultation with bus operators and provincial offices. Messages were sent to customers who have booked trains that have been canceled as a result of the strike. Affected customers will get a full refund on the price of their train ticket. Kim Jae-hee, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.